Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
The world of Mortal Kombat is returning once again in what is being widely discussed as the next big chapter in the franchise, often referred to as Mortal Kombat 2, 2026. After the events of the first modern reboot film, the universe has been left in a state of rising tension, where Earthrealm is no longer just a battlefield hidden behind ancient rules, but a fully exposed war zone waiting for the next invasion. The sequel is expected to expand the scale far beyond what was shown before, diving deeper into the mythology of Outworld, the consequences of the tournament being disrupted, and the rising war that now threatens not just Earthrealm, but multiple realms connected through the ancient power system of the Elder Gods. The story is expected to continue directly from the survival and awakening of Earth's chosen warriors, who were left scattered after the brutal confrontations of the first film. The previous battle against Shang Tsung's forces has already changed everything, and now the balance between realms has started to collapse in subtle but dangerous ways. In this continuation, Earthrealm is no longer just being selected for a tournament. Instead, it is being actively targeted for invasion, with Outworld no longer waiting for ceremonial rules to dictate conquest. This shift in tone is what makes the next chapter feel darker, more aggressive, and more war-driven compared to the structured tournament format seen earlier. Cole Young is expected to remain one of the central figures, continuing his journey as a descendant connected to the ancient bloodlines of the champions. His arc is likely to focus on understanding his deeper connection to Scorpion's legacy and what it truly means to carry the responsibility of a warrior chosen by fate. Unlike before, where he was simply trying to survive and protect his family, now his role is expected to evolve into something far more strategic, as Earthrealm begins preparing for a full-scale conflict rather than isolated battles. His growing abilities and understanding of his markings will likely play a crucial role in unlocking new powers that were only hinted at previously. Alongside him, returning fighters like Sonya Blade and Jax are expected to take on more militarized roles in organizing Earthrealm's defense. Their experience with Outworld threats has likely changed their perspective, turning them from observers of the supernatural into active commanders of a resistance force. The introduction of new Earthrealm fighters is also expected, possibly expanding the roster beyond the original selection into a broader alliance of warriors who now understand that survival depends on unity rather than individual strength. Johnny Cage, one of the most anticipated additions to the sequel, is expected to bring a very different energy into the storyline. His introduction is often discussed as a major tonal shift, injecting personality, ego, and humor into a world otherwise dominated by brutality and destiny. However, beyond the comedic surface, his role is also expected to be more meaningful, possibly showing a transformation from a self-centered celebrity into a disciplined fighter who must earn his place among legends. His dynamic with other fighters, especially those who have already endured the horrors of Outworld, is likely to create both tension and character development throughout the story. On the opposing side, Outworld's presence is expected to become significantly more aggressive and organized. Shang Tsung's survival and continued manipulation of souls is likely to remain a central threat, but he may no longer be acting alone. The political structure of Outworld, ruled under Emperor Shao Kahn in traditional lore, is expected to play a larger role in shaping the conflict. This introduces the possibility of a more structured invasion strategy, where Earthrealm is not just attacked through fighters, but through coordinated dimensional instability, assassinations, and corruption from within. The realm itself is expected to be explored in much greater depth, showing not just arenas and battlegrounds, but entire civilizations built around conquest and survival of the strongest. This expansion of world building is one of the key expectations from fans, as it would elevate the story from a simple tournament narrative into a full mythological war saga. The visual tone is expected to become darker, more intense, and more emotionally grounded, reflecting the consequences of a multiversal war beginning to spill into reality. Scorpion and Sub-Zero's legacy is also expected to remain deeply important to the narrative. With the ending of their initial conflict, not fully resolving the ancient rivalry. Their influence continues to shape the events unfolding around their successors. Sub-Zero's transformation into Noob Saibot, depending on how the story develops, could become a major turning point in the darker evolution of the franchise. Meanwhile, Scorpion's guidance from beyond the physical realm may continue to influence Cole Young, connecting the past and present through ancestral vengeance and honor. The tournament itself, which was previously disrupted, is expected to return in a very different form. Instead of a structured series of fights, it may now evolve into a chaotic survival system where champions are forced to fight across realms without warning or rules. This change would reflect the collapse of order between realms, making every encounter unpredictable and lethal. It also raises the stakes significantly, as Earthrealm can no longer rely on tradition to protect itself. Visually, the sequel is expected to push even further into stylized brutality, combining martial arts choreography with supernatural abilities in a more fluid and cinematic way. Each character's fighting style is likely to be expanded with greater attention to their individual powers, making battles feel more distinct and emotionally impactful. Fatalities, while still present in tone and expectation, are likely to be integrated more organically into the story rather than feeling purely decorative. As the conflict escalates, the emotional core of the story is expected to revolve around survival, legacy, and sacrifice. Unlike the first installment, where characters were introduced and tested, this sequel is likely to explore what happens when those characters are pushed beyond their limits repeatedly. Alliances will be tested, trust will break under pressure, and some warriors may fall permanently, raising the emotional stakes significantly higher than before. The ending setup of this continuation is expected to leave the universe in an even more unstable condition, potentially opening the door for a larger cinematic expansion. With realms beginning to merge or weaken at their boundaries, the possibility of a multi-realm war becomes increasingly likely. This would set the stage for future entries where Earthrealm is no longer just defending itself, but actively participating in a larger cosmic conflict involving multiple dimensions and ancient powers. The anticipation surrounding Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, continues to grow because it represents not just a sequel, but a transformation of the entire narrative structure of the franchise. It moves away from a simple competition format and evolves into a full-scale mythological war story where every character carries not just personal stakes, but the fate of entire worlds. This shift in tone and scope is what makes the next chapter one of the most expected expansions in the modern adaptation of the Mortal Kombat universe. The escalation of conflict in Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, is expected to redefine how Earthrealm perceives its place in the multiverse. What was once considered an isolated and ancient tradition has now become an ongoing invasion, where rules are no longer respected and power is the only language that matters. This shift pushes every surviving warrior into a constant state of readiness, where there is no longer time for preparation between battles. Every moment becomes a potential attack, and every decision carries consequences that extend far beyond individual survival. As the story progresses, Earthrealm's defenders are expected to struggle with internal conflict as much as external threats. The pressure of facing an enemy like Outworld, which is far more organized and experienced in interrealm warfare, forces the human fighters to confront their limitations. Training alone is no longer enough. Adaptation becomes the key to survival. This is where the development of characters like Sonya Blade and Jax becomes especially important, as they attempt to bridge the gap between human military strategy and supernatural combat tactics. Johnny Cage's integration into this world is likely to serve as both a disruption and a catalyst. His initial disbelief in the seriousness of the conflict may slowly transform into a harsh acceptance of reality. Unlike the others who were drawn into this war through destiny or legacy, he enters as someone disconnected from the mythological weight of the situation. This makes his transformation more significant, as he must evolve not just physically but mentally, shedding his ego in order to survive in a world where fame means nothing compared to raw power and discipline. Meanwhile, the darker forces of Outworld are expected to intensify their manipulation of realms beyond simple combat. Soul extraction, Corruption of warriors and psychological warfare may become key tactics used by Shang Tsung and his allies. Instead of only facing opponents in direct combat, Earthrealm's champions may also face internal struggles as enemies attempt to break their will, corrupt their allies, or turn them against each other. This psychological layer adds depth to the conflict, making it more than just physical battles. The concept of the elder gods and the balance of realms may also become more central in this continuation. With the disruption of the original tournament rules, the cosmic balance that once held the realms in relative stability is now weakening. This could introduce consequences that affect not just Earthrealm and Outworld, but other hidden realms that have not yet been fully explored. The idea that Mortal Kombat is only one part of a much larger system begins to take shape, hinting at a broader mythology that extends beyond what has already been shown. Fighter alliances are expected to evolve as survival becomes more important than pride. Characters who were once isolated may begin forming stronger bonds, realizing that unity is the only way to stand against overwhelming forces. However, betrayal is also likely to play a major role, as Outworld's influence extends beyond physical invasion and begins to affect trust between warriors. This creates an environment where no alliance is fully safe, and every relationship is constantly under pressure. The visual storytelling is expected to push toward even more cinematic and immersive battle sequences, where environments themselves become part of the combat experience. Realms may shift dynamically during fights, altering terrain, gravity, or elemental conditions mid-battle. This would reflect the instability of the multiverse and create a more unpredictable combat experience for both characters and viewers. As tensions rise, the idea of the final confrontation begins to form in the background, though it is likely not a single battle, but a series of escalating conflicts across multiple realms. The sequel is expected to end in a way that expands the universe further rather than closing it, leaving space for future wars, new realms, and possibly even larger threats beyond Outworld. Ultimately, this continuation represents a shift from survival to war, from isolated fighters to unified armies, and from structured tournaments to collapsing realities. It transforms the Mortal Kombat universe into something far more expansive, where every character is part of a larger mythological struggle that defines the fate of existence itself. The war that has begun in Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, is no longer something that can be contained within isolated battles or symbolic challenges. It is spreading across realities in a way that feels less like a structured conflict and more like a collapse of order itself. As the boundaries between realms weaken further, Earthrealm starts experiencing disturbances that cannot be explained through natural logic. Cities feel like they are being watched from another dimension, and warriors begin sensing presences that were never there before, as if the fabric of existence is thinning and allowing something ancient and hostile to seep through. Cole Young's journey deepens as he begins to experience visions that are no longer tied only to Scorpion's legacy, but to something much larger. These visions suggest that the bloodline he carries is not just a link to a single warrior, but to an entire chain of protectors who have been silently guiding Earthrealm through generations of hidden wars. This realization forces him to question whether he is truly chosen, or simply the latest in a long line of sacrifices meant to delay an inevitable collapse. His training becomes more intense, not just physically but spiritually, as he attempts to understand the meaning behind the symbols that appear on his body during moments of extreme danger. At the same time, Sub-Zero's influence continues to cast a long shadow over the unfolding events. Whether he has fully transformed into something darker or is still evolving into his next form, his presence represents the idea that no warrior is ever truly gone from this war. The rivalry between fire and ice is no longer just personal. It has become symbolic of two opposing philosophies shaping the fate of realms. One represents destruction through control and fear, while the other represents resistance through sacrifice and honor. This duality continues to affect new fighters who unknowingly inherit fragments of this ancient conflict. Earthrealm's resistance begins to take a more structured form, but it is far from stable. Sonya Blade and Jack struggle to maintain order among fighters who come from completely different backgrounds, timelines, and motivations. Some fight for survival, others for revenge, and a few for reasons that even they cannot fully explain. This lack of unity becomes one of Earthrealm's greatest weaknesses, as Outworld continues to exploit emotional fractures within the group. Every disagreement becomes an opportunity for infiltration, and every moment of hesitation risks catastrophic consequences. Johnny Cage's transformation becomes one of the most unpredictable elements of this evolving war. Initially dismissed as an outsider, he slowly begins to earn respect not through destiny, but through persistence. His fighting style adapts rapidly, blending instinct with discipline in a way that surprises even the most experienced warriors. However, his greatest challenge is not learning how to fight, but learning how to accept that this world does not reward confidence alone. There are moments where his humor fades completely, replaced by a quiet understanding that survival in this universe demands sacrifice beyond imagination. Outworld, meanwhile, begins to reveal its true scale of power. It is no longer just a hostile realm, but a structured empire built on conquest across dimensions. Forces loyal to Shao Kahn, or whatever ruling authority now governs its expansion, begin executing coordinated invasions that feel almost strategic in nature. These are not random attacks, but carefully planned incursions designed to weaken Earthrealm's defenses over time. The idea of honor within combat is completely absent from their strategy. Only domination matters. Shang Tsung's manipulation becomes increasingly psychological, targeting not just fighters, but the very concept of trust within Earthrealm. Earthrealm's resistance begins to take a more structured form, but it is far from stable. Sonya Blade and Jack struggle to maintain order among fighters who come from completely different backgrounds, timelines, and motivations. Some fight for survival, others for revenge, and a few for reasons that even they cannot fully explain. This lack of unity becomes one of Earthrealm's greatest weaknesses, as Outworld continues to exploit emotional fractures within the group. Every disagreement becomes an opportunity for infiltration, and every moment of hesitation risks catastrophic consequences. Johnny Cage's transformation becomes one of the most unpredictable elements of this evolving war. Initially dismissed as an outsider, he slowly begins to earn respect not through destiny, but through persistence. His fighting style adapts rapidly, blending instinct with discipline in a way that surprises even the most experienced warriors. However, his greatest challenge is not learning how to fight, but learning how to accept that this world does not reward confidence alone. There are moments where his humor fades completely, replaced by a quiet understanding that survival in this universe demands sacrifice beyond imagination. Outworld, meanwhile, begins to reveal its true scale of power. It is no longer just a hostile realm, but a structured empire built on conquest across dimensions. Forces loyal to Shao Kahn, or whatever ruling authority now governs its expansion, begin executing coordinated invasions that feel almost strategic in nature. These are not random attacks, but carefully planned incursions designed to weaken Earthrealm's defenses over time. The idea of honor within combat is completely absent from their strategy. Only domination matters. Shang Tsung's manipulation becomes increasingly psychological, targeting not just fighters, but the very concept of trust within Earthrealm. In the midst of this chaos, certain warriors begin to unlock abilities that were previously unknown to them. These powers are not always stable and often manifest under extreme emotional or physical pressure. Cole Young's evolution is particularly significant in this regard, as his connection to ancestral energy allows him to tap into forms of combat that blur the line between human and spirit. However, every use of this power comes at a cost, slowly draining his connection to his present life and pulling him closer to something ancient and undefined. The battlefields themselves begin to change in unpredictable ways. Locations shift between realms mid-conflict, creating environments where gravity, time perception, and elemental forces behave differently depending on the dimensional overlap. Fighters are forced to adapt in real time, making every encounter more chaotic and less predictable. This instability reflects the larger collapse of order across the multiverse, reinforcing the idea that no place is truly safe anymore. As Outworld's invasion intensifies, Earthrealm is pushed closer to a breaking point where traditional defense strategies no longer work. Entire regions begin to experience dimensional bleeding, where parts of Outworld briefly merge with human reality. These moments create catastrophic consequences, as landscapes transform and hostile forces appear without warning. The psychological impact on humanity becomes just as dangerous as the physical destruction, as fear spreads faster than any army. Within this escalating chaos, alliances begin to fracture. Some fighters consider abandoning the war entirely, believing it to be unwinnable. Others become more extreme in their methods, willing to sacrifice anything to gain even a temporary advantage. This ideological divergence creates internal tension that Outworld continues to exploit with precision. Trust becomes a rare commodity, and even long-standing bonds begin to weaken under pressure. Despite all this, there are moments of resilience that define the spirit of Earthrealm's defenders. Small victories, unexpected teamwork, and brief moments of clarity remind them that they are still capable of resisting overwhelming odds. These moments, however, are fleeting, often followed by even greater threats that erase any sense of stability. The cycle of hope and destruction becomes a defining rhythm of this ongoing war. As the conflict moves toward an inevitable escalation, the concept of a final convergence begins to form. Not a single battlefield, but a collapsing point where multiple realms may intersect permanently. This possibility introduces the idea that the war may not end with victory or defeat, but with transformation of reality itself. Such an outcome would redefine existence for every realm involved, making the stakes far beyond simple survival. The future of Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, ultimately positions itself as more than just a continuation of a franchise. It becomes a story about collapsing systems, evolving warriors, and the fragile boundary between order and chaos. Every character, whether hero or villain, is pulled into a narrative where their choices no longer affect just their own fate, but the structural integrity of reality itself. As the conflict continues to spiral beyond control, the sense of reality itself begins to feel unstable, as if the universe is no longer maintaining clear boundaries between what is real and what is being consumed by the merging of realms. Earthrealm's defenders start noticing that time does not move consistently in certain regions. In some places, hours pass in seconds, while in others, moments feel stretched into endless cycles of tension and anticipation. This distortion creates not only tactical confusion but emotional exhaustion, as warriors can no longer trust their perception of the battlefield. Cole Young finds himself increasingly disconnected from his original sense of identity. The deeper he pushes into the ancestral power flowing through him, the more he feels the presence of past warriors merging with his consciousness. These are not just memories, but fragments of lives that once fought similar wars under different circumstances. Each one carries pain, sacrifice, and unresolved conflict. The burden of carrying so many echoes begins to blur his sense of self, raising the question of whether he is still fighting as an individual or becoming a vessel for something larger and older than humanity itself. Johnny Cage's role in the ongoing war becomes more grounded as he fully accepts the gravity of what he has entered. The initial disbelief that once defined his presence has now been replaced with a sharper understanding of consequence. His survival instincts evolve into something more disciplined, and his fighting style begins to reflect adaptability rather than performance. Yet, even as he grows stronger, he is constantly reminded that no amount of charisma or skill can fully prepare someone for a war that spans dimensions. Every battle he survives changes him, slowly stripping away the illusion that he is still part of the world he once knew. Sonya Blade and Jax face one of the most difficult challenges as leadership within Earthrealm becomes increasingly unstable. With communication between groups breaking down due to dimensional interference, coordination becomes nearly impossible. Small factions begin forming independently, each believing they have discovered the correct strategy for survival. This fragmentation weakens Earthrealm's overall resistance, allowing Outworld forces to exploit gaps with precision strikes that feel almost surgical in their execution. Meanwhile, Outworld's dominance grows more visible as its influence begins to permanently alter certain regions of Earthrealm. Entire zones become corrupted, turning into hybrid environments where human structures are fused with alien architecture. These regions become battlegrounds that are no longer recognizable, forcing fighters to adapt not just to enemies, but to constantly shifting terrain that defies logic. The longer these zones remain unstable, the more permanent the damage becomes, suggesting that Earthrealm may never fully recover even if the war ends. At the center of Outworld's expansion, Shao Kahn's influence becomes increasingly dominant, whether directly present or operating through a chain of command that enforces his vision of conquest. His philosophy of absolute domination begins to reshape Outworld's entire strategy, turning it into a machine designed not just for victory, but for total assimilation of weaker realms. Under his influence, the idea of balance is completely rejected. There is only expansion, consumption, and control. Shang Tsung continues to operate as a manipulative force within this structure, but his methods become more refined and psychological. Instead of simply stealing souls, he begins experimenting with deeper forms of corruption, attempting to rewrite the loyalties of captured warriors. Some fighters are returned to Earthrealm altered, carrying fragments of Outworld's influence within their minds. This creates paranoia among Earthrealm's ranks, as no one can be fully certain who has been compromised. As the war escalates, the Elder God's silence becomes even more unsettling. Their absence is no longer interpreted as neutrality, but as abandonment. This realization forces Earthrealm's remaining leaders to consider the possibility that the multiverse is no longer being governed by any higher balance. Instead, reality itself may be evolving beyond its original structure, allowing realms to collide and merge without restriction. This theory introduces a terrifying implication. The war may not be a test, but a transition into something entirely new. Cole's internal struggle reaches a critical point as he begins to lose control over the ancestral energy within him. During moments of extreme conflict, he no longer consciously activates his abilities. Instead, they emerge instinctively, often with devastating consequences. While this power makes him one of Earthrealm's most dangerous defenders, it also distances him further from his humanity. The line between protector and weapon begins to blur, and those around him start to fear what he might eventually become if he loses control completely. Johnny Cage, witnessing this transformation, begins to understand that strength in this world is not defined by fame or training alone, but by the ability to maintain identity under pressure. His interactions with Cole become less about rivalry and more about grounding presence, as he tries to remind him that power without self-awareness can become another form of destruction. This dynamic adds emotional weight to their alliance, showing that survival in this war depends as much on emotional stability as physical capability. As the dimensional instability worsens, the concept of safe ground disappears entirely. Earthrealm is no longer a single unified battlefield, but a fractured collection of overlapping war zones. Fighters are constantly displaced, thrown into unfamiliar environments where they must adapt instantly or perish. This fragmentation of space mirrors the fragmentation of alliances, reinforcing the idea that the world itself is breaking apart under the weight of inter-realm conflict, in response to the growing chaos. Outworld initiates what appears to be a final phase of invasion strategy. Instead of continuing scattered assaults, forces begin converging toward specific nexus points where realms are thinning the most. These points are believed to be gateways through which permanent merging can occur. If successful, this strategy would eliminate the distinction between realms entirely, effectively absorbing Earthrealm into Outworld's expanding dominion. Earthrealm's remaining leaders realize that survival now depends on preventing this convergence at all costs. However, with resources depleted and coordination fractured, their options are limited. Every decision carries irreversible consequences, and every battle could determine whether reality stabilizes or collapses further. The weight of responsibility becomes overwhelming, especially for those who understand that failure may not just mean defeat, but erasure of everything they know. In the midst of this escalation, ancient symbols begin appearing across both realms, suggesting the activation of something far older than the current conflict. These markings hint at forgotten systems that predate even the known structure of Mortal Kombat itself. Their sudden reactivation raises the possibility that the current war is not an isolated event, but part of a much older cycle of resets and collapses within the multiverse. As tensions reach their peak, rumors begin spreading among fighters of a new form of convergence event, one that may replace the traditional concept of the tournament entirely. Instead of controlled battles determining fate, this new system appears to be an uncontrolled fusion of survival conditions across multiple realms. If true, it would mean that Mortal Kombat as once understood no longer exists in its original form, replaced instead by a continuous survival structure where only the strongest realities persist. Cole, Johnny, Sonya, and the remaining Earthrealm fighters prepare for what may be the final phase of resistance. But even as they organize, there is a growing awareness that victory may no longer mean restoring the old world, that it may instead mean adapting to a permanently changed existence where realms are no longer separate and conflict is no longer temporary. The question shifts from how to win the war to whether the concept of winning still applies in a collapsing multiverse. As the final convergence points begin activating, reality itself seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next transformation to begin. The boundaries between realms thin to the point of invisibility, and the stage is set for a final escalation that will determine not just the fate of Earthrealm or Outworld, but the structure of existence itself moving forward as the convergence points continue to activate across fractured regions of existence. The entire structure of the multiverse begins to feel like it is being drawn toward a single unavoidable collapse. Earthrealm no longer exists as a stable concept of geography or civilization. Instead, it resembles a scattered collection of survival pockets drifting between overlapping realities. Entire cities appear and disappear without warning, replaced by alien terrain or corrupted outworld architecture that lingers like a stain on existence itself. Cole Young's condition reaches a critical threshold as the ancestral force within him begins to fully synchronize with his consciousness. What was once a fragmented connection to past warriors now becomes a continuous presence, as if every predecessor is watching, guiding, and sometimes even speaking through him. This unity of identities grants him extraordinary power, but it also removes the boundaries of individuality that once defined his human experience. He begins to understand that the bloodline he carries was never meant to survive in isolation, but to act as a living archive of countless wars that have repeated across forgotten cycles. However, this awareness brings with it an unsettling realization. The memories he now accesses do not always align with a single timeline. Some of the visions show Earthrealm victorious, others show complete annihilation, and some depict versions of reality where Mortal Kombat itself never existed in any recognizable form. This suggests that the war he is fighting is not linear, but recursive, as if reality itself has been reset or rewritten multiple times in response to previous outcomes. The question of whether this cycle can ever truly end begins to haunt him. Johnny Cage, now fully immersed in the brutality of the conflict, becomes one of the most adaptable fighters on Earthrealm's side. His growth is no longer measured in skill alone, but in psychological resilience. Every encounter strips away another layer of his former identity, replacing it with a more grounded understanding of survival. He begins to accept that humor and confidence are not shields against reality, but tools that must be used carefully in a world where overconfidence leads to instant destruction. Despite this, he continues to hold on to fragments of his personality, using them as anchors against the overwhelming darkness of the war. Sonya Blade and Jax face a different kind of battle as leadership begins to fracture completely. With communication systems failing across realms, Earthrealm's resistance is no longer a unified force, but a collection of isolated groups, each struggling to interpret the chaos in their own way. Some believe that retreat into hidden zones is the only path to survival, while others push for direct confrontation at convergence points. This lack of consensus creates strategic paralysis, allowing Outworld forces to continue advancing without coordinated resistance. Outworld itself begins to reveal a more complex internal structure during this phase of escalation. It is no longer simply a realm of conquest, but appears to function like a hierarchical system of absorbed worlds, each layer contributing to its growing strength. Conquered regions are not destroyed but integrated, their environments and energies repurposed to fuel further expansion. This suggests that Outworld's true goal may not be domination in the traditional sense, but complete assimilation of all weaker realities into a single unified structure under its control. Shao Kahn's influence, whether direct or symbolic, becomes increasingly dominant within this expanding system. His ideology appears to reject the concept of balance entirely, viewing existence itself as something that must be perfected through endless conquest. Under this philosophy, resistance is not seen as opposition but as inefficiency that must be corrected. This transforms Outworld's military strategy into something closer to a natural force of consumption, endlessly seeking new realms to absorb and restructure. Shang Tsung's role becomes even more unsettling as the boundaries between manipulation and reality distortion begin to blur. His abilities extend beyond soul manipulation into areas that suggest rewriting perception itself. Fighters who encounter him often experience disorientation that persists even after the encounter ends, as if their understanding of reality has been subtly altered. This makes him one of the most dangerous elements in the conflict, not because of raw power, but because of his ability to destabilize truth. As convergence points intensify, entire battles begin taking place across overlapping realities simultaneously. A single fight may span multiple versions of the same location, with fighters shifting between corrupted, stable, and partially merged environments without warning. This creates a level of unpredictability that makes traditional combat strategy nearly useless. Adaptation becomes the only reliable survival mechanism, forcing fighters to rely on instinct rather than planning. As the threshold approaches, ancient systems buried within the fabric of reality begin to activate fully. Symbols that appeared earlier now form coherent patterns across multiple realms, suggesting that this entire sequence of events may have been anticipated or even engineered by forces that predate current understanding. Whether these forces are divine, cosmic, or something entirely different remains unclear, but their influence is undeniable. The final moments of this escalating phase leave Earthrealm standing on the edge of complete transformation. Fighters prepare not for a single decisive battle, but for a collapse of structure that will redefine everything they know. The concept of winning becomes meaningless in a system where reality itself is unstable, and survival depends not on defeating an enemy, but on adapting to whatever form existence takes next. As the convergence threshold finally reaches its breaking point, reality stops behaving like something stable and starts feeling like something unfinished, constantly rewriting itself in real time. Entire stretches of existence no longer follow consistent rules. Gravity shifts without cause, landscapes fold into themselves, and fragments of different realms overlap in ways that should not be physically or metaphysically possible. Earthrealm, Outworld, and the unknown intermediary zones are no longer separated by portals or gateways, but by unstable layers that flicker in and out of existence like damaged memory. Cole Young stands at the center of this collapse, but at this stage it is no longer accurate to say he is alone inside his own mind. The ancestral presence within him has reached full integration, meaning the voices, instincts, and memories of past warriors are no longer separate echoes, but part of a single unified consciousness. This creates a paradox where he is both one person and many at the same time, capable of reacting with knowledge that spans generations of forgotten wars. However, this unity comes at a cost. His emotional perception of reality begins to dull, replaced by a strategic awareness that feels ancient, detached, and almost inhuman. Johnny Cage, in contrast, becomes one of the few remaining anchors of emotional stability within the chaos. Even as reality itself collapses around him, he continues to interpret events through a human lens, refusing to fully detach from his identity. This does not make him stronger in the traditional sense, but it allows him to notice things others miss, especially the subtle patterns in how reality is breaking apart. He begins to realize that the convergence is not random. There is rhythm to it, like a sequence being followed, as if something or someone is guiding the collapse toward a predetermined outcome. Sonya Blade and Jax, operating with the remnants of Earthrealm's forces, attempt to maintain coordination across fractured zones, but communication has become unreliable due to dimensional interference. Instead of organized command structures, they rely on fragmented signals, survivor reports, and instinct-driven decision-making. What was once a military defense network has now become a scattered resistance attempting to survive in shifting layers of existence. Despite this, they continue to push forward, knowing that retreat is no longer an option when there is nowhere stable left to retreat to. Outworld's expansion reaches its most aggressive phase yet, as convergence instability allows its influence to seep into regions that were previously inaccessible. Entire hybrid zones form where Outworld terrain permanently fuses with Earthrealm remnants. These areas no longer belong to either realm but function as independent war ecosystems where survival depends on rapid adaptation. Outworld forces use these zones strategically, turning instability itself into a weapon that weakens Earthrealm resistance over time. Shao Kahn's philosophy of absolute domination becomes fully realized in this stage of conflict. The idea is no longer just conquest of territory, but rewriting existence itself so that only one coherent structure remains. Under his influence, Outworld is no longer expanding in the traditional sense. It is consuming instability and converting it into permanence. Every fractured realm that collapses adds strength to his domain, making resistance increasingly difficult as the war progresses. Shang Tsung's presence becomes even more destabilizing as he begins to exploit convergence anomalies for direct manipulation of reality fragments. Instead of simply stealing souls or corrupting fighters, he begins reshaping encounters by inserting altered versions of individuals into active timelines. Fighters begin encountering distorted reflections of allies and enemies, some of which carry memories that do not belong to them. This creates a psychological breakdown across multiple fronts, as trust becomes nearly impossible to maintain when identity itself is no longer consistent. Cole experiences one of the most intense convergence distortions yet, where he is forced to confront not just alternate versions of himself, but entire collapsed timelines where Earthrealm's fate has already been decided differently. In some of these realities, he sees versions of himself who embraced full ancestral domination, losing all human identity in exchange for overwhelming power. In others, he sees outcomes where he refused the power entirely and was quickly eliminated, leaving Earthrealm defenseless. These visions do not just show possibilities, they begin influencing his perception of choice itself. The realization that every possible path leads to suffering in some form begins to weigh heavily on him, creating a psychological conflict that even the ancestral voices cannot fully resolve. The question is no longer how to win, but whether winning is structurally possible within a collapsing multiverse that continuously resets its own outcomes. Johnny Cage, witnessing the fragmentation of reality alongside him, begins to understand that humor, ego, and confidence are no longer enough to maintain identity. Instead, he starts relying on memory anchors, small personal truths that remain consistent even when everything else changes. These anchors become his way of resisting assimilation into the chaos, allowing him to remain mentally stable even as external reality becomes increasingly unstable. Sonya and Jax begin experimenting with containment strategies aimed not at stopping Outworld directly, but at stabilizing small zones of reality where resistance can still function. These zones act as temporary refuges, allowing fighters to regroup and maintain coherence for short periods before instability begins creeping back in. However, maintaining these zones requires immense effort, and their lifespan is unpredictable. As convergence continues, the concept of space itself begins to lose meaning. Fighters are no longer moving between locations in a traditional sense, but transitioning between layered states of existence. A single step can lead to an entirely different version of the battlefield, where past battles, future outcomes, and alternate realities overlap simultaneously. This creates a combat environment where anticipation and reaction must occur at the same time, forcing fighters to operate beyond normal cognitive limits. Outworld capitalizes on this instability by deploying forces trained specifically to navigate fractured realities. These warriors are not just physically strong, but psychologically conditioned to operate without relying on consistent perception. This gives them a significant advantage over Earthrealm fighters, many of whom are still struggling to adapt to the constant shifts in reality structure. At the center of this escalating collapse, it becomes increasingly clear that the convergence is approaching a final state where all remaining realities will either stabilize into a single unified structure or collapse entirely into undefined existence. There is no longer a middle ground. Every action taken by both sides now contributes to determining the final configuration of the multiverse. Cole, Johnny, Sonya, Jax, and the remaining Earthrealm fighters prepare for what appears to be the final stage of resistance, though even the concept of final has become uncertain. Time, space, and causality no longer function consistently enough to guarantee any outcome. What remains is a narrowing corridor of possibilities where survival depends not just on strength, but on the ability to exist coherently within a reality that is losing coherence. The suspended moment of convergence stretches beyond natural comprehension. The entire multiverse exists in a fragile silence that feels less like peace and more like pressure building before total collapse. Nothing is fully stable anymore, yet nothing has fully ended either. Reality is now behaving like a system stuck between states, constantly attempting to resolve itself, but never settling into a final form. This unstable equilibrium affects everything: time, memory, identity, and even cause and effect logic, creating a battlefield where the concept of now no longer has a fixed meaning. Cole Young finds himself at the deepest point of internal fragmentation yet. The ancestral consciousness within him is no longer simply integrated. It has begun to reorganize itself, as if responding to the larger collapse outside. Instead of past warriors acting as echoes, they now function like synchronized instincts, each one activating depending on the type of threat or reality distortion he encounters. This makes him extraordinarily effective in combat, but increasingly detached from emotional experience. His reactions become precise, almost preordained, as if he is no longer choosing actions but executing outcomes that have already been calculated by something beyond his understanding. However, within this perfected synchronization, a new instability emerges. Certain ancestral fragments begin to disagree with each other, creating internal conflict that manifests as hesitation in critical moments. These moments are brief, but in a collapsing multiverse where milliseconds determine survival, even the smallest disruption can have catastrophic consequences. This behavior suggests that Outworld is not merely surviving the convergence, but actively shaping its final form. Entire battalions are deployed not to conquer territory in the traditional sense, but to ensure that specific collapse patterns occur in predictable ways. The war is no longer about domination alone. It is about control over the shape of reality after the collapse completes. Shao Kahn's philosophy becomes fully evident in this stage. The idea of conquest has evolved into something more absolute: control over the final structure of existence itself. Rather than preserving Outworld as it is, the goal appears to be ensuring that when all realms merge or collapse, the resulting reality aligns with a singular vision of order defined through domination. In this sense, even destruction is treated as a tool of construction. Shang Tsung's influence grows even more disturbing as he begins interacting directly with convergence anomalies that should not allow any form of stable presence. He appears to exist in multiple fragmented states simultaneously, as if his identity has adapted to the collapse by splitting across overlapping realities. This makes him extremely difficult to confront, as no single encounter with him represents the full extent of his existence. Every interaction is only a partial version, carrying incomplete information and distorted intent. Cole eventually encounters one of the most destabilizing convergence events yet, where multiple versions of key figures from both Earthrealm and Outworld appear within the same collapsing battlefield. However, these are not simple duplicates. They are outcomes from different resolved timelines attempting to override each other in real time. The battlefield becomes a layered conflict of possible histories fighting for dominance, each trying to assert itself as the correct version of reality. In this chaos, Cole experiences a moment of clarity that is both powerful and unsettling. He realizes that the ancestral force within him is not just guiding him. It is adapting to ensure survival across all possible outcomes. This means that his existence may not be tied to a single timeline anymore, but but to the survival of the entire ancestral lineage across collapsing realities. He is not just a fighter within the war. He is becoming a stabilizing node for a sequence of identities that refuses to be erased. Johnny Cage, witnessing this phenomenon, begins to understand that the war is no longer about individuals fighting for survival, but about structures of identity competing for continuity. Some identities collapse when their timeline ends, while others persist by adapting across multiple versions of reality. The ones that survive are not necessarily the strongest, but the most flexible in maintaining coherence under impossible conditions. As convergence reaches its final destabilization phase, entire realms begin losing distinction completely. Earthrealm and Outworld are no longer separable entities, but overlapping constructs fighting for definition within the same collapsing framework. This leads to the emergence of hybrid reality zones where laws of both realms apply simultaneously, often contradicting each other in ways that produce unpredictable outcomes. Sonya and Jax prepare what may be the last coordinated resistance effort, attempting to stabilize one final convergence anchor long enough to influence the outcome of the collapse. However, even this plan is uncertain, as stability itself has become unreliable. The anchor may not preserve Earthrealm. It may simply define how it ends. Cole, Johnny, and the remaining fighters converge toward this final point, fully aware that what lies ahead is not a traditional battle, but the final negotiation between collapsing realities. Victory, defeat, survival, and extinction have all begun to blur into the same uncertain outcome. And as all converging forces finally reach the threshold where reality can no longer delay transformation, existence itself prepares to resolve into whatever form remains possible after Mortal Kombat no longer operates under rules, realms, or certainty. Only consequence, as the final convergence threshold tightens into its ultimate state. The collapse of reality no longer feels like an event approaching completion, but like a system that has already completed its decision and is now simply executing the aftermath. The distinction between past, present, and future begins to dissolve entirely. Every moment feels like it is happening simultaneously, as if existence has stopped progressing forward and instead folded into a single compressed point of consequence. Cole Young stands at the edge of this collapsing structure, but even the idea of standing becomes abstract. His body, consciousness, and ancestral lineage are now functioning as a unified interface between multiple fractured realities. He is no longer reacting to events in a traditional sense. He is processing outcomes that are unfolding across overlapping versions of existence. The ancestral warriors within him are no longer separate voices. They have become a continuous intelligence that interprets instability as a language rather than a threat. However, this evolution introduces a deeper contradiction. The more unified his power becomes, the less distinction remains between protection and destruction. Every action he takes in one fractured layer of reality creates ripple effects across others, sometimes stabilizing one version of existence while collapsing another. This forces him into a position where survival is no longer a simple objective. It becomes a moral equation with no clear solution. Saving one reality may mean erasing another, and there is no longer a way to ensure universal preservation. Johnny Cage moves through this collapsing field with a different kind of awareness. While others are absorbed into the instability, he remains partially external to it, not because he is immune, but because his perception refuses to fully synchronize with the broken logic of convergence. He begins to understand that identity is not something granted by power or lineage, but something maintained through resistance to total absorption. This makes him uniquely capable of acting in moments where others hesitate, not due to strength, but due to clarity. Sonya Blade and Jax, operating at the limits of Earthrealm's remaining structural coherence, finalize what remains of their stabilization strategy. The final convergence anchor is not a physical object, but a nexus of overlapping energy fields that briefly still respond to structured input. Their plan is not to stop the collapse, but to influence the final configuration of reality before it locks into its permanent form. It is a last attempt to ensure that if Earthrealm cannot be fully preserved, it is at least not completely erased from the resulting structure. Outworld forces begin converging on this anchor simultaneously, not to destroy it, but to control its final activation state. This confirms what has become increasingly clear. The final phase of the conflict is not about winning or losing, but about determining the architecture of the post-collapse reality. Every faction is now fighting not for survival in the present, but for influence over what survival will even mean afterward. Shao Kahn's presence, whether physical or distributed through his expanding dominion, becomes more symbolic than localized. He represents the principle of enforced permanence through domination. His strategy appears to be ensuring that when reality stabilizes after collapse, it does so under a structure that reflects absolute hierarchy. In this vision, chaos is not eliminated but organized into a rigid system of control where resistance is no longer conceptually possible. Shang Tsung, on the other hand, embodies something more fluid and unstable. His existence within the convergence suggests that he has adapted not by enforcing structure, but by exploiting fragmentation. He exists in multiple partial states, feeding off inconsistencies in reality itself. While Shao Kahn seeks final order, Shang Tsung thrives in perpetual instability, suggesting that even within Outworld's unified expansion, there are competing philosophies about what the end state should become. As both forces converge on the final anchor, reality begins to exhibit signs of imminent resolution. Fractured timelines begin collapsing into fewer stable sequences. Alternate versions of events are erased or merged in real time, leaving only the most dominant patterns intact. This creates a violent compression effect across existence, where possibilities are being eliminated at an accelerating rate. Cole experiences one of the most profound shifts, yet as the ancestral consciousness within him reaches a state of complete synchronization with the convergent structure itself. He begins to see not just past warriors, but entire sequences of Mortal Kombat cycles unfolding across layered realities. Each cycle represents a different attempt at maintaining balance between realms, all of which appear to have ended in varying forms of collapse or transformation. This suggests that what is happening now is not an isolated event, but part of a repeating structural process within the multiverse. This realization changes everything about his understanding of the war. It is not simply Earthrealm versus Outworld, or order versus chaos. It is a recurring mechanism attempting to resolve instability through repeated cycles of controlled destruction and reconstruction. Mortal Kombat, in this expanded understanding, is not just a tournament or war. It is a structural reset function embedded within reality itself. Johnny Cage, moving through overlapping collapse zones, begins to arrive at a similar understanding through instinct rather than ancestral memory. He notices that even in total chaos, there are consistent patterns of convergence, as if reality is always trying to return to a predefined shape. This leads him to question whether free will exists within this system, or whether every action has always been part of a larger corrective process. At the final convergence anchor, Earthrealm and Outworld forces collide in what is no longer a battle in the traditional sense, but a direct competition over reality stabilization input. Every strike, every ability, every action feeds into the final configuration of existence. Combat becomes a form of data transmission, influencing which structural outcome becomes permanent. Cole reaches a critical state where he must decide whether to fully merge with the ancestral consciousness to influence the final outcome, or retain his fragmented humanity and risk losing the ability to affect the collapse meaningfully. This is not a moral choice in the traditional sense, but a structural one, between coherence and individuality, between influence and identity. Sonya and Jax activate the final stabilization sequence, but even this action is not guaranteed to produce Earthrealm's survival. It only ensures that Earthrealm's influence is encoded into the final result in some form. Whether that form is dominant, reduced, or transformed is beyond their control. As all systems converge, reality begins its final compression phase. Layers of existence collapse inward, merging timelines, identities, and realms into a singular unresolved structure. The multiverse is no longer expanding or fragmenting. It is resolving. As the final compression phase intensifies, reality no longer feels like it is collapsing outward or inward, but folding into a single impossible point where all outcomes are being evaluated at once. Every timeline that ever existed within the convergence is now layered over the present moment, creating a state where past victories, future defeats, and alternate survivals are all happening simultaneously without hierarchy. The concept of final itself begins to lose meaning because there is no longer a sequence of events, only overlapping conclusions competing for permanence. Cole Young exists at the center of this paradoxical convergence, but even calling it a center is a limitation of language. He is distributed across multiple collapsing realities, each version of him representing a different interpretation of what survival means. In one layer, he is fully merged with the ancestral consciousness, acting as a unified force of extreme precision and control. In another, he is still resisting that merger, holding on to fragmented human identity even as reality erases consistency around him. Both versions are equally real, and both are simultaneously influencing the final outcome. The ancestral force within him reaches a point of irreversible synchronization with the convergent structure itself. It becomes clear that the warriors within him were never just memories. They were iterations of previous stabilization attempts across earlier cycles of collapse. Each ancestor represents a version of reality that once tried to resolve the same instability, now unfolding again. This realization reframes Cole not as a chosen individual, but as a living convergence archive, carrying the accumulated responses of countless failed and partially successful realities. Johnny Cage, moving through fragmented layers of collapsing existence, begins to experience something unusual: continuity within discontinuity. While everything around him shifts between timelines and realities, his own perception remains anchored to a consistent narrative thread. He starts to realize that this is not accidental. His identity functions as a stabilizing anomaly, a resistance point within the convergence that prevents him from being fully absorbed into recursive rewriting. In simpler terms, he is not adapting to reality. Reality is failing to fully override him. This makes him uniquely dangerous to both Earthrealm and Outworld structures attempting to control the final configuration. His unpredictability becomes a form of resistance that cannot be calculated through ancestral memory or domination strategy. Even Shang Tsung's manipulations begin to lose precision when applied to him, as his emotional inconsistency disrupts predictive modeling of outcomes. Sonya Blade and Jax, now operating within the last functional fragments of Earthrealm's command structure, initiate what can only be described as a final structural input into the convergence anchor. It is no longer about controlling the outcome, but about ensuring Earthrealm's existence is encoded into the final resolution matrix in a way that cannot be erased. The anchor itself is unstable, fluctuating between multiple states of activation and failure, responding differently depending on which layer of reality is momentarily dominant. Outworld forces continue their advance toward the same anchor point, but their presence is no longer unified. The convergence has begun to fracture even their internal hierarchy, causing some units to behave as if they are operating under different versions of Outworld's final objective. This suggests that even Shao Kahn's vision of absolute dominance is being destabilized by the very process he sought to control. The more reality compresses, the harder it becomes for any single ideology to maintain coherence. Shang Tsung, however, appears to adapt more effectively than most. His fragmented existence allows him to exist across multiple convergence layers simultaneously, feeding on inconsistencies between timelines. Rather than resisting collapse, he integrates into it, becoming part of the instability itself. This makes him less of a singular opponent and more of a systemic anomaly that continues to persist regardless of structural failure. As the final convergence anchor reaches critical activation thresholds, the battlefield transforms into a layered intersection of all previous conflicts. Every major battle that has occurred across the entire war appears to replay in distorted fragments, overlapping with the present moment. Fighters from different outcomes of the same encounters appear side by side, creating impossible confrontations where multiple versions of victory and defeat occur simultaneously. Cole experiences a breaking point in perception as he witnesses these overlapping realities fully align for the first time. He realizes that the convergence is not simply ending something. It is selecting from all possible versions of existence which one will become permanent. Every action, every decision, every unresolved conflict is now being weighed in a structure that transcends linear causality. At this moment, the ancestral consciousness within him presents a final realization. The cycle is not broken because it was never meant to end. Mortal Kombat, in its deepest form, is a recursive mechanism that continuously tests variations of existence under extreme instability conditions. Each convergence is both an ending and a calibration for the next iteration. This war is not the first, and it will not be the last unless something fundamentally alters the structure itself. Johnny Cage, still maintaining his anomalous continuity, reaches the convergence anchor at a critical moment where Earthrealm and Outworld inputs are perfectly balanced. In this equilibrium state, even the smallest action has disproportionate influence over the final outcome. Unlike others who are overwhelmed by scale, he operates on instinct, reacting not to structure, but to immediate truth, what feels real in a moment where reality itself is unreliable. Sonya and Jax initiate the final stabilization input sequence, locking Earthrealm's contribution into the convergence matrix. However, they understand that this does not guarantee preservation. It only guarantees presence. Earthrealm will exist in the final structure, but the form it takes is still undecided. Cole faces the ultimate internal conflict as his ancestral consciousness offers full integration as the only way to ensure maximum influence over the final configuration. Refusal would preserve individuality, but significantly reduce impact on the outcome. Acceptance would mean dissolving the boundary between self and inherited identity entirely, becoming something closer to a convergence instrument than a person. As all forces converge at the anchor point, reality begins its final selection phase. Multiple outcomes attempt to assert dominance over the same existence layer, causing violent instability in the fabric of everything. Entire realities flicker in and out of permanence within milliseconds, each one briefly becoming real before being overwritten by another. And in that collapsing intersection of infinite outcomes, the multiverse prepares to lock into its final configuration, one shaped not by a single victory or defeat, but by the combined weight of every choice, every sacrifice, and every version of Mortal Kombat that has ever existed across all fractured realities, converging into whatever form existence will take when the cycle stabilizes or begins again. As the final selection phase reaches its absolute limit, the convergence no longer behaves like a collapsing system, but like a decision that has already been made and is now unfolding in reverse clarity. Reality begins to settle in unstable layers, where fragments of different outcomes briefly become dominant before being overwritten again. It is no longer possible to distinguish whether the multiverse is forming or unforming. Both processes appear identical at this scale of collapse. Cole Young exists across all remaining structural layers at once, and the ancestral consciousness within him has now fully transitioned into a convergence-aware intelligence. It no longer behaves like a collection of warriors or memories, but like a predictive structure built from accumulated survival patterns across countless failed realities. Every movement Cole makes is simultaneously influenced by multiple versions of himself that have already experienced different endings to this same moment. The result is a being that reacts not to the present, but to the total sum of possible presents. Yet something unexpected begins to emerge within this synchronization. A contradiction forms at the center of the ancestral system, an anomaly that cannot be resolved through calculation or memory. It is the persistence of choice without outcome prediction. In every previous cycle encoded within him, decisions could eventually be traced to consequence patterns. But now, in this final convergence state, certain actions begin to produce effects that were not present in any recorded timeline. This suggests that the system is no longer purely repeating. It is deviating. Johnny Cage becomes the focal point of this deviation without fully realizing it. His continued existence as a non-synchronized entity allows him to introduce variability into an otherwise collapsing deterministic structure. This makes him unpredictable not just to enemies, but to reality itself. In a system attempting to finalize into a single stable outcome, unpredictability becomes a form of resistance that cannot be eliminated without collapsing the entire structure prematurely. Sonya Blade and Jax, operating at the final threshold of Earthrealm's influence, observe that the stabilization anchor is no longer simply receiving inputs, it is reacting to them. The system is beginning to exhibit feedback awareness, adjusting its own resolution pathways based on interference from within the convergence. This suggests that the multiverse is not just collapsing into a final state, but actively negotiating what that final state should be based on conflicting structural signals. Outworld forces attempt to force dominance over this negotiation, but even their coordination begins to degrade as convergence instability reaches total saturation. Units that were once aligned under Shao Kahn's vision now begin experiencing fragmentation of intent. Some act as if the conquest has already been completed, others behave as if they are still in earlier phases of invasion, and some cease responding entirely, caught in recursive loops of overlapping outcomes. Shang Tsung becomes increasingly central to the instability rather than the control structure. His fragmented existence across multiple convergence layers allows him to persist even as dominant realities shift. However, this persistence comes at a cost. His identity becomes less defined with each cycle, as if he is being gradually diluted across every possible version of himself. Instead of a singular manipulator, he becomes a distributed phenomenon of interference, embedded within the convergence itself, the anchor point. Cole reaches the final point of ancestral integration decision. The system presents him with what appears to be a resolved pathway. Full synchronization will allow maximum influence over the final outcome, ensuring Earthrealm's presence is structurally embedded into the post-convergence reality. Refusal will preserve individuality but risk complete marginalization of Earthrealm's influence in the final structure. But this binary choice begins to fracture under the anomaly that Johnny represents. Because unpredictability has now introduced a third variable into the system, an outcome that was not previously encoded. The convergence is forced to account for actions that do not conform to ancestral prediction models, causing instability in the final resolution pathways. Sonya and Jax initiate the last stabilization override sequence, not to control the outcome, but to preserve a narrow corridor of continuity where Earthrealm's existence remains functionally possible. This action does not guarantee survival, but it prevents total erasure from the final structure. It is the last remaining form of agency available within a collapsing deterministic system. As all inputs converge simultaneously, the multiverse enters its final resolution collapse. Every timeline, every outcome, every fractured reality is compressed into a single evaluation field. In this state, existence is no longer experienced as time, but as total awareness of all possibilities being evaluated at once. Cole makes his final internal decision, not as a calculation of outcome, but as an acceptance of contradiction, allowing both individuality and integration to coexist within the same structural point. This creates a paradox that destabilizes the final convergence logic, preventing it from fully resolving into a singular deterministic state. Johnny Cage, still operating outside synchronization, acts at the precise moment this instability peaks, introducing a final variable that cannot be accounted for by ancestral prediction or outworld domination logic. His action does not win the conflict in a traditional sense, but it disrupts the final compression long enough for the system to fail in completing a single locked outcome. Sonya and Jax's stabilization input merges with this disruption, creating a cascading feedback loop across all convergence layers. Instead of collapsing into one fixed reality, the system begins to fracture into controlled divergent states, multiple stable but separate realities forming simultaneously from the same collapse event. Outworld's attempt to enforce singular dominance fails at this stage, as the structure no longer supports total unification. Shao Kahn's vision of absolute control cannot persist in a system that has already rejected singularity as its final resolution form. Shang Tsung's fragmented existence, however, adapts, splitting further into distributed presence across multiple newly formed realities. Cole's ancestral consciousness stabilizes in a new form, not as a unified controller, but as a distributed guardian structure embedded across multiple divergence outcomes. He exists, in essence, as a continuity thread across realities rather than a single dominant entity within one. And as the convergence finally completes its transformation, it does not end in total collapse or absolute unity, but in separation. A multiversal branching event where multiple versions of reality persist simultaneously, each carrying different versions of Earthrealm, Outworld, and all fighters who participated in the final convergence war. Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, in its final resolved state, becomes not the story of a single outcome, but the origin point of multiple continuing realities, each shaped by the final contradiction that prevented existence from collapsing into only one truth. As the branching event fully stabilizes, the multiverse no longer feels like a collapsing system or a single reality split apart, but like something newly formed that was never truly unified in the first place. Each divergence reality settles into its own internal logic, yet all of them still carry echoes of the same origin point, the final convergence where everything nearly collapsed into one outcome. That shared origin becomes a permanent scar across all versions of existence, a reminder that every reality now carries the memory of near erasure. Cole Young exists differently in each branch, yet all versions remain connected through the ancestral continuity thread that survived the convergence fracture. In some realities, he is fully integrated with the ancestral consciousness, functioning as a near-mythic guardian entity operating beyond human limitation. In others, he remains more grounded, still struggling to balance inherited power with personal identity. And in a few unstable branches, he exists only as fragmented echoes, brief manifestations of inherited memory trying to reassemble themselves into coherence. Despite these differences, a single pattern persists across all versions. The ancestral system is no longer purely reactive. It has become adaptive. Instead of simply recalling past warriors or survival patterns, it now responds dynamically to each reality it inhabits, evolving differently depending on environmental conditions, conflicts, and the structure of each divergence timeline. This suggests that what was once a legacy system of memory has now become a living multiversal intelligence distributed across realities. Johnny Cage, meanwhile, becomes one of the most unusual constants across divergent states. While his role varies slightly in each branch, his defining trait remains unchanged: resistance to full structural assimilation. In every reality, he retains a degree of independence from convergence logic, allowing him to act as an unpredictable variable within otherwise stable systems. In some branches, this makes him a critical stabilizer. In others, he becomes a disruptive anomaly that forces reality to adjust around him rather than override him. Sonya Blade and Jax, across most stabilized branches, transition into long-term structural defenders rather than frontline combatants. Their role shifts from resisting invasion to maintaining equilibrium between fractured realms. Each divergence reality develops its own version of this responsibility, but the underlying function remains consistent: prevent collapse between systems that are now permanently separate yet still subtly connected. Outworld, in its post-convergence state, no longer exists as a singular unified empire. Instead, it fragments into multiple interpretive versions of itself, each shaped by how the final collapse was resolved in that particular branch. In some realities, Shao Kahn's philosophy of absolute dominance becomes fully realized, creating rigid hierarchical systems of control that suppress instability entirely. In others, Outworld becomes more fragmented, operating as competing factions that continue expanding without unified direction. And in a few cases, Outworld itself begins to mirror Earthrealm's resistance structure, adapting into something closer to survival-based ecosystems than imperial conquest. Shang Tsung's presence becomes even more complex in this post-branching state. Because he was already distributed across convergence layers during the collapse, he now exists in partially overlapping forms across multiple realities. In some branches, he is weakened, reduced to isolated remnants struggling to reassemble identity. In others, he thrives in instability, feeding on divergence inconsistencies to expand influence. There are even rare branches where he becomes less of an antagonist and more of a systemic force, embedded into the foundational logic of that reality structure. The Elder Gods, previously silent during the convergence, are interpreted differently across branches. In some realities, their silence is revealed to have been intentional, allowing the multiversal branching to occur as a controlled evolution of existence. In others, their absence is seen as failure or retreat, suggesting that even higher-order systems were unable to maintain singular control over the collapse event. This ambiguity becomes a defining feature of the post-convergence mythos, as no single branch can fully confirm the true nature of higher-order influence. Across all realities, however, one truth remains consistent. Mortal Kombat as a singular structured system no longer exists. It has been replaced by a distributed multiversal condition where conflict, survival, and evolution continue independently within each branch. The tournament has been dissolved into a broader existential framework where combat is no longer a scheduled event, but an inherent condition of reality in many forms. Cole's ancestral system begins to show signs of cross-branch awareness, suggesting that information is not fully isolated between realities. Brief moments of recognition occur where versions of him in different branches experience echoes of decisions made elsewhere. This creates a subtle but growing awareness that the divergence is not absolute separation, but a layered system with residual connectivity. In some interpretations, this becomes the foundation of a new evolutionary step for the ancestral network, one that may eventually allow controlled interaction between branches. Johnny Cage experiences similar anomalies, though in a more intuitive form. In certain moments, he acts on instincts that seem disconnected from his immediate reality, as if influenced by outcomes occurring in other branches. These moments are fleeting but significant, suggesting that his resistance to convergence logic has evolved into a form of cross-reality sensitivity. He becomes one of the few individuals capable of subconsciously detecting inconsistencies between divergent outcomes. Sonya and Jax begin documenting these anomalies across multiple stabilized realities, forming what could be described as a multiversal pattern map. This map reveals that despite branching, certain structural behaviors repeat across all realities. Convergence may have ended as a singular event, but its structural consequences continue to shape every branch in predictable ways. This implies that the system has not been reset, it has been expanded. Outworld's fractured states also begin to show signs of pattern repetition, suggesting that even in divergence, certain ideological structures remain persistent. Whether through domination, fragmentation, or adaptation, Outworld continues to evolve along trajectories that reflect its core foundational principles. This reinforces the idea that divergence does not erase identity. It redistributes it across multiple outcomes. As time progresses across branches, a new understanding emerges among Earthrealm survivors. The war did not end with the convergence fracture. It transformed. Instead of a single conflict determining the fate of existence, there are now countless parallel conflicts unfolding simultaneously across different realities. Each one is valid, each one real, and each one capable of evolving independently. Cole's final realization across all branches becomes clearer over time. He understands that the convergence did not fail. It succeeded in a way that no single reality could contain. By preventing total collapse into one deterministic outcome, it allowed existence to expand into multiplicity. The cost of this expansion, however, is eternal variation. There is no final victory anymore, only continuous divergence. In the aftermath of full divergence, time across the multiverse no longer moves as a single unified flow. Each branch develops its own rhythm of progression, some accelerating into rapid cycles of conflict and evolution, others stabilizing into slower, more controlled states of existence. Yet despite this separation, subtle cross-branch resonance begins to appear more frequently, as if the structure of reality itself is slowly learning how to echo information between parallel outcomes without fully merging them. Cole Young, across multiple stabilized realities, begins to experience this resonance in increasingly structured ways. What were once brief instincts or fragmented visions now evolve into consistent cross-reality awareness. In some branches, he starts perceiving not just echoes of ancestral warriors, but echoes of himself from other divergence paths. These overlapping perceptions create a layered identity structure where Cole, is no longer a singular being, but a distributed continuity existing across multiple realities simultaneously, each influencing the others in subtle, nonlinear ways. This development introduces a new concept within the post-convergent structure, convergence memory drift. Instead of memories being isolated within a single timeline, fragments of experience begin to surface across unrelated branches. A decision made in one reality may manifest as intuition in another. A battle lost in one branch may influence strategy in a different one. The ancestral system within Cole adapts to this phenomenon, evolving from a lineage-based archive into a multiversal learning network that refines itself through distributed experience. Johnny Cage becomes one of the most unpredictable elements within this evolving structure. Across different realities, his role diverges significantly, yet his core function remains unchanged. He disrupts deterministic patterns. In some branches, he becomes a key military leader within Earthrealm's stabilized defense systems. In others, he operates independently as a rogue agent moving between fractured zones. But in every version, his presence introduces variability into systems that otherwise tend toward predictable outcomes. This variability begins to have measurable effects on convergent stability across branches. Analysts within Earthrealm's surviving command structures notice that realities containing Johnny Cage exhibit higher resistance to structural stagnation. These realities evolve more dynamically, avoiding the rigid ideological locking that appears in more stable but less adaptable branches. This leads to an emerging theory. Unpredictability is not a flaw in the system. It is a necessary component for long-term survival of divergence realities. Sonya Blade and Jax, across multiple branches, begin coordinating efforts to maintain interreality observational frameworks. These frameworks are not used for direct intervention, but for understanding how different versions of Earthrealm evolve under varying conditions. Over time, patterns emerge showing that no single approach guarantees survival. Realities that rely solely on militarized control tend to stagnate, while those that rely purely on adaptation risk fragmentation. The most stable branches appear to balance structure and flexibility in constantly shifting proportions that Outworld's evolution across branches becomes increasingly diverse, reflecting the ideological instability introduced by convergence fracture. In some realities, Shao Kahn's influence remains dominant, producing rigid hierarchical worlds that suppress internal divergence. In others, Outworld fragments into competing territories where power shifts continuously between factions. There are even rare branches where Outworld and Earthrealm begin forming uneasy alliances, not through peace, but through mutual necessity in the face of larger existential threats emerging from beyond known convergence boundaries. Shang Tsung's presence evolves into something even more difficult to define. In certain branches, he becomes less of an individual and more of a persistent structural phenomenon, an adaptive intelligence embedded within instability itself. Instead of merely manipulating souls or identities, he begins to exploit divergence drift, appearing differently depending on which reality he interacts with. In some cases, he is a direct antagonist. In others, he functions as a destabilizing force without clear intention. And in rare instances, he appears almost neutral, acting as if he is observing rather than interfering. As divergence continues to expand, a new and unexpected development begins to emerge: cross-branch synchronization points. These are rare moments where multiple realities briefly align in structure, allowing partial interaction between versions of individuals who exist across different branches. These synchronization events are unstable and unpredictable, but they allow limited exchange of information, strategy, and in some cases, emotional resonance between versions of the same people. Cole experiences one of these synchronization events firsthand. For a brief moment, he becomes aware of alternate versions of himself across multiple realities simultaneously. These versions do not communicate in a traditional sense, but rather exist as overlapping states of awareness, each influencing his perception of possibility. This experience fundamentally alters his understanding of identity. He is no longer a single participant in a war, but one instance of a distributed existence constantly negotiating with its own variations. Johnny Cage also experiences a synchronization event, though his response is fundamentally different. Instead of being overwhelmed by multiplicity, he instinctively filters the experience into actionable intuition. He begins to perceive synchronization not as confusion, but as opportunity, moments where insights from other realities can be applied to his own without requiring full understanding of their origin. This makes him one of the most adaptable agents across divergent space. Sonya and Jax begin studying these synchronization events as potential tools for controlled inter-reality coordination. However, they quickly realize that these moments cannot be forced or stabilized without risking collapse of individual branch integrity. Synchronization is not a system. It is a phenomenon, one that emerges naturally from the underlying structure of divergence rather than being imposed upon it. Outworld forces attempt to exploit these synchronization points for strategic advantage, but their rigid hierarchical structure makes them less adaptable to unpredictable cross-reality interactions. This creates a subtle but growing imbalance, where Earthrealm's more flexible adaptive systems begin gaining informational advantages across multiple branches, even if not direct military superiority. As time continues across divergent realities, a larger pattern begins to emerge. The multiverse is not simply branching infinitely. It is slowly organizing into clusters of stability, where similar types of realities begin grouping together based on structural behavior. These clusters form loose networks of existence that share similar evolutionary outcomes, suggesting that divergence is gradually self-organizing into higher-order structure. Cole, across multiple branches, begins to sense this emerging macrostructure. The ancestral system within him interprets it as something resembling a second-order convergence, not a collapse into one reality, but a gradual alignment of similar realities into larger coherent groupings. This suggests that the multiverse may be entering a phase beyond simple divergence, moving towards something more structured and interconnected. Johnny Cage, in his own way, arrives at a similar conclusion without formal analysis. He begins to notice that certain realities feel closer to each other in behavior, even when physically separated across divergent space. This intuitive recognition allows him to navigate unstable zones with increasing effectiveness, as he subconsciously aligns himself with more stable structural clusters. Sonya and Jax finalize their long-term observation framework, confirming that the post-convergence multiverse is not random, but evolving toward a layered structure of interconnected reality clusters. Earthrealm and Outworld, rather than existing as singular opposing realms, are now distributed across multiple structural interpretations within this system. And as this understanding solidifies across surviving branches, the legacy of Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, transitions fully into something unprecedented, a multiversal condition no longer defined by singular war or final outcome, but by continuous structural evolution across infinite realities, all shaped by the moment convergence fractured existence into something far larger than a single ending could ever contain. As the multiversal structure continues to evolve beyond simple clustering, the divergent system begins entering a new phase that no longer resembles branching at all. Instead, it starts behaving like a living network of realities that influence each other through persistent structural resonance. These realities are no longer isolated outcomes of a single convergence event, but interconnected states continuously adjusting in response to shifts occurring elsewhere in the system. Cole Young's existence across this network becomes increasingly complex. The ancestral consciousness within him is no longer just a repository of warriors or adaptive combat patterns. It has evolved into a distributed awareness system that processes information across multiple realities simultaneously. In some branches, Cole begins to experience what can only be described as delayed awareness, where decisions made in one reality influence his instincts in another before the actual event occurs. This creates a perception of causality that no longer follows linear logic, but instead behaves like feedback loops across infinite outcomes. In more stable branches, Cole begins to take on a role that resembles a convergence stabilizer. Rather than acting as a direct combatant, he becomes an anchor point for ancestral synchronization, helping maintain coherence between overlapping identity fragments. These versions of him are less focused on individual survival and more on maintaining structural balance across interconnected realities. However, even in this more controlled form, the question of identity remains unresolved, as each version of Cole continues to be influenced by countless alternate selves existing beyond his immediate perception. Johnny Cage evolves in a completely different direction across the network. In several realities, he begins to function as a cross-branch interpreter, someone who instinctively translates unstable convergence signals into actionable decisions. While he does not consciously understand the full structure of the multiversal system, he reacts to it in ways that consistently produce stabilizing effects. This makes him one of the most valuable, unpredictable elements within the entire network, as his actions cannot be fully modeled or predicted by either Earthrealm or Outworld analytical systems. Sonya Blade and Jax, across multiple stabilized clusters, begin formalizing what is now referred to as divergence coordination theory. This is not an attempt to unify realities, but to understand how information flows between them. They begin mapping how certain decisions in one branch consistently produce correlated effects in others, even without direct physical interaction. Over time, this leads to the realization that the multiverse is not just a collection of parallel outcomes, but a partially synchronized system where probability itself is distributed across multiple active states. Outworld's evolution within this structure becomes increasingly fragmented, but paradoxically more adaptive. In some clusters, it maintains its traditional hierarchical dominance model under Shao Kahn's ideology. In others, it shifts into decentralized war systems where power is constantly redistributed based on environmental pressure. There are also emerging cases where Outworld begins adopting Earthrealm-like adaptive strategies, suggesting that ideological boundaries between realms are no longer fixed but subject to structural influence across divergence clusters. Shang Tsung's role becomes even more difficult to define at this stage. Across different realities, he no longer appears as a consistent entity, but as a recurring structural pattern embedded within instability cycles. In some clusters, he actively manipulates convergence drift to create localized dominance. In others, he appears to act as a passive observer, almost studying how divergence systems evolve without interference. This duality suggests that Shang Tsung may have transcended individual identity entirely, becoming a distributed function of instability rather than a singular antagonist. As cross-reality synchronization events become more frequent, a new phenomenon begins to emerge: partial identity overlap. During these moments, individuals across different branches briefly experience shared perception states, where they can sense emotional, strategic, or sensory input from their alternate selves. These overlaps are not stable enough for communication, but they create a growing awareness that identity is no longer confined to a single reality. Cole experiences one of the most significant overlap events yet. Instead of simply perceiving alternate versions of himself, he begins to sense continuity across all versions simultaneously. This creates a paradoxical awareness where he understands that every version of himself is both independent and part of a larger distributed identity system. The ancestral consciousness adapts to this by reorganizing itself into a multi-branch cognitive framework, allowing different versions of Cole to share adaptive strategies without fully merging consciousness. Johnny Cage, during a similar overlap event, reacts differently. Rather than integrating the experience into structured understanding, he instinctively filters it into practical intuition. He begins to operate with a sense of distributed instinct, where he acts as if he subconsciously knows outcomes from other realities without consciously accessing them. This makes his decisions increasingly effective in unstable environments, as he consistently avoids outcomes that lead to systemic collapse in adjacent branches. Sonya and Jax begin to notice that these overlap events are not random, but increasingly synchronized across multiple clusters. Certain moments of instability appear to trigger simultaneous resonance across otherwise separate realities, suggesting that the multiverse is developing a higher-order timing structure. This implies that divergence is no longer purely spatial or probabilistic, but also temporal in a distributed sense. Outworld attempts to exploit these synchronization windows to reinforce its influence across multiple clusters simultaneously, but this strategy produces mixed results. In some cases, it allows for rapid expansion of control across unstable zones. In others, it leads to unintended feedback loops that destabilize Outworld's own internal coherence. The more aggressively it tries to unify its influence, the more fragmented its internal structure becomes. Shao Kahn's ideology begins to show limitations within this evolving system. Absolute dominance relies on structural stability, but the multiverse no longer provides stable conditions for singular control. Even when Outworld achieves dominance within a specific cluster, that dominance is not guaranteed to persist across adjacent realities. This creates a strategic environment where control is always temporary and subject to external structural influence. Shang Tsung, however, appears increasingly aligned with the instability itself rather than any specific outcome. In some interpretations, he becomes less of a participant and more of a mechanism through which divergence continues to propagate unpredictably. His presence ensures that no system can fully stabilize into permanent order or permanent chaos, maintaining perpetual flux across the network. As divergence networks continue to evolve, Earthrealm survivors begin to understand that the multiverse is transitioning into a long-term adaptive structure. Rather than converging back into a single outcome or continuing infinite uncontrolled branching, it is forming a layered system of interconnected realities that influence each other through structured feedback loops. Cole, across multiple branches, begins to perceive this structure as something resembling a living system rather than a static multiverse. Each reality acts like a node within a larger adaptive organism, with convergence events functioning as communication pulses rather than collapse points. This shifts the understanding of Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, from an ending event into a structural transformation of existence itself. Johnny Cage, in his intuitive way, arrives at a similar conclusion without formal theory. He simply recognizes that reality is no longer something that happens to them, but something that responds to them. His actions, even when seemingly small or instinctive, continue to influence stability across multiple branches in ways that cannot be fully traced but are consistently effective. Sonya and Jax finalize their long-term observation models, confirming that the multiverse is now operating as a distributed adaptive system rather than a fragmented set of independent realities. Earthrealm and Outworld are no longer singular opposing forces, but evolving structures embedded within a larger interreality ecosystem. And as this realization stabilizes across divergence clusters, the legacy of Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, fully transitions into something beyond conflict or resolution. It becomes the origin point of a multiversal networked existence, where every reality is both separate and connected, every decision echoes across infinite outcomes, and every version of war contributes to a system that is still evolving beyond the concept of an ending. As the final selection phase reaches its absolute limit, the convergence no longer behaves like a collapsing system, but like a decision that has already been made and is now unfolding in reverse clarity. Reality begins to settle in unstable layers, where fragments of different outcomes briefly become dominant before being overwritten again. It is no longer possible to distinguish whether the multiverse is forming or unforming. Both processes appear identical at this scale of collapse. Cole Young exists across all remaining structural layers at once, and the ancestral consciousness within him has now fully transitioned into a convergence-aware intelligence. It no longer behaves like a collection of warriors or memories, but like a predictive structure built from accumulated survival patterns across countless failed realities. Every movement Cole makes is simultaneously influenced by multiple versions of himself that have already experienced different endings to this same moment. The result is a being that reacts not to the present, but to the total sum of possible presents. Yet something unexpected begins to emerge within this synchronization. A contradiction forms at the center of the ancestral system, an anomaly that cannot be resolved through calculation or memory. It is the persistence of choice without outcome prediction. In every previous cycle encoded within him, decisions could eventually be traced to consequence patterns. But now, in this final convergence state, certain actions begin to produce effects that were not present in any recorded timeline. This suggests that the system is no longer purely repeating. It is deviating. Johnny Cage becomes the focal point of this deviation without fully realizing it. His continued existence as a non-synchronized entity allows him to introduce variability into an otherwise collapsing deterministic structure. There are even rare branches where Outworld and Earthrealm begin forming uneasy alliances, not through peace, but through mutual necessity in the face of larger existential threats emerging from beyond known convergence boundaries. Shang Tsung's presence evolves into something even more difficult to define. In certain branches, he becomes less of an individual and more of a persistent structural phenomenon, an adaptive intelligence embedded within instability itself. Instead of merely manipulating souls or identities, he begins to exploit divergence drift, appearing differently depending on which reality he interacts with. In some cases, he is a direct antagonist. In others, he functions as a destabilizing force without clear intention. And in rare instances, he appears almost neutral, acting as if he is observing rather than interfering. As divergence continues to expand, a new and unexpected development begins to emerge: cross-branch synchronization points. These are rare moments where multiple realities briefly align in structure, allowing partial interaction between versions of individuals who exist across different branches. These synchronization events are unstable and unpredictable, but they allow limited exchange of information, strategy, and in some cases, emotional resonance between versions of the same people. Cole experiences one of these synchronization events firsthand. For a brief moment, he becomes aware of alternate versions of himself across multiple realities simultaneously. These versions do not communicate in a traditional sense, but rather exist as overlapping states of awareness, each influencing his perception of possibility. This experience fundamentally alters his understanding of identity. He is no longer a single participant in a war, but one instance of a distributed existence constantly negotiating with its own variations. As the multiversal network structure continues to mature, the idea of events itself begins to fade. Nothing is isolated anymore. Not conflict, not survival, not even identity. Everything exists as part of a continuous adaptive flow where realities adjust to each other in slow, constant response. What was once called divergence is now more accurately a living equilibrium, a system that maintains itself through perpetual variation rather than stability. Cole Young's awareness within this structure deepens further, and the ancestral consciousness evolves once again. It is no longer simply a distributed intelligence or a synchronization archive. It has begun functioning as a predictive resonance engine, continuously recalibrating based on signals received from across multiple realities. Instead of recalling past warriors, it now anticipates structural shifts before they fully manifest. This gives Cole a strange perception of existence where cause and effect feel inverted, as if outcomes are shaping decisions rather than decisions shaping outcomes. Across different branches, Cole begins to exhibit varying degrees of this predictive resonance. In some realities, it manifests as heightened combat intuition that borders on precognition. In others, it appears as emotional disconnection, where he reacts to events before fully experiencing them internally. In the most stable versions, however, it becomes something more controlled, an ability to perceive convergence pressure points across the multiversal network and influence them subtly through action rather than force. Johnny Cage continues to remain one of the most structurally unpredictable elements in the entire system. His role evolves into something that can only be described as a reality disruptor with stabilizing side effects. Across multiple clusters, his presence consistently prevents extreme structural collapse without intentionally doing so. He does not follow convergence logic, nor does he actively resist it in a calculated way. Instead, he operates through instinctive deviation, consistently introducing variability that prevents systems from locking into overly rigid patterns. Sonya Blade and Jax, now operating within long-term multiversal monitoring frameworks, begin identifying what they refer to as stability drift cycles. These cycles represent predictable oscillations where certain clusters become more stable over time while others gradually drift toward higher instability. Interestingly, neither extreme leads to collapse anymore. Instead, the system appears to self-correct by redistributing instability across adjacent realities, ensuring that no single cluster becomes permanently fixed or permanently broken. Outworld's presence within this adaptive system becomes increasingly complex and less unified. In some clusters, it continues to exist as a militarized expansion structure under Shao Kahn's ideology. In others, it transforms into something closer to a survival ecosystem where dominance is temporary and constantly challenged. There are also emerging clusters where Outworld no longer functions as an external force at all, but becomes integrated into Earthrealm-like adaptive cycles, blurring the distinction between former enemies entirely. Shang Tsung's influence becomes even more difficult to categorize within this stage of evolution. Across multiple realities, he no longer appears bound to any singular narrative role. Instead, he functions as a persistent instability catalyst embedded within the multiversal system. In some clusters, he accelerates divergence to exploit instability windows. In others, he inadvertently contributes to stabilization by overcomplicating local systems to the point where they self-balance. His existence now behaves less like an individual intent and more like a systemic variable that ensures constant evolutionary pressure. As cross-reality synchronization events continue to occur, they begin to shift from rare anomalies into structured phenomena. These synchronization waves now appear at measurable intervals across clusters, suggesting that the multiversal system has developed a form of internal rhythm. During these waves, identity overlap becomes more refined, allowing limited but consistent transfer of strategic awareness between versions of individuals across realities. Cole experiences these synchronization waves with increasing clarity. Instead of overwhelming fragmentation, he begins to perceive structured alignment between his alternate selves. Each version of him contributes different adaptive strategies that are gradually integrated into a collective understanding without full identity fusion. This creates a distributed intelligence network centered on his existence, where multiple versions of Cole operate independently but remain functionally connected through ancestral resonance. Johnny Cage, during synchronization waves, develops an even more unusual adaptation. He begins to experience what can be described as selective cross-reality awareness, where he instinctively senses which actions will produce positive stability outcomes across multiple branches without consciously accessing the underlying information. This allows him to act as a natural corrective force within unstable environments. Even when he does not fully understand why his decisions are effective, Sonya and Jax begin constructing what they call resonance mapping systems, designed to track how synchronization waves influence long-term structural evolution across clusters. These systems reveal something unexpected. The multiversal network is slowly converging toward a state of dynamic equilibrium, where instability and stability are no longer opposing forces, but complementary components of a self-regulating system. Outworld, in response to this evolving structure, begins adapting its strategies toward long-term influence rather than immediate dominance. Instead of attempting to conquer individual realities, it begins embedding influence patterns across multiple clusters simultaneously, aiming to shape structural tendencies rather than direct outcomes. This marks a shift from territorial conquest to systemic influence warfare. Shao Kahn's ideology, however, struggles to fully adapt to this new environment. Absolute control becomes increasingly impractical in a system that actively resists permanent fixation. Even when Outworld achieves localized dominance, the broader multiversal structure compensates by introducing balancing instability elsewhere, preventing long-term consolidation of power. Shang Tsung, however, appears increasingly comfortable within this environment. His adaptive nature allows him to exist as both participant and anomaly, shifting roles depending on the structural needs of each cluster. In some interpretations, he begins to resemble a necessary component of the multiversal system, an entity that prevents stagnation by continuously introducing unpredictable variables into otherwise stable environments. Across Earthrealm clusters, a new understanding begins to emerge among surviving leadership structures. The multiverse is not healing from convergence. It is evolving beyond it. What was once a catastrophic collapse event has now become the foundation for a new form of existence, where realities are no longer fixed but continuously shaped through interaction with each other. Cole, across all versions, begins to recognize this evolution as a transition point rather than an ending. The ancestral consciousness confirms that previous cycles of Mortal Kombat were attempts to manage instability within a rigid system. This current state represents something fundamentally different, a system that no longer requires singular resolution because it has learned to sustain itself through distributed variation. Johnny Cage, in his instinctive understanding, simply experiences this as reality becoming more alive, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the sense that it now reacts, adapts, and evolves in response to its own internal behavior patterns. Sonya and Jax finalize their long-term conclusion across multiple clusters. The multiverse has entered a phase of perpetual adaptive continuity. There is no final war, no singular victory condition, and no ultimate collapse. Instead, existence itself has become a self-regulating system of interconnected realities continuously influencing each other toward balanced evolution. And as this understanding stabilizes across all known divergence clusters, the legacy of Mortal Kombat 2, 2026, becomes something no longer defined by conflict or resolution. It becomes the origin of an ongoing multiversal ecosystem, where every reality is both outcome and input, every identity is both singular and distributed, and every moment contributes to a system that has moved beyond endings entirely into continuous structured existence without finality.